In the last couple of videos, we've been working on this Chevy bedside. First, I shared with you how to straighten metal. I gave you all the tips and techniques I use to get that metal properly prepared for some body filler. And then last week, we went over how to use body filler, how to mix it, shape it, block it, control your high and low areas, and get it ready for primer. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about a couple different primers that I use, how I go about using them, and how they're going to work perfectly whether you're doing a collision repair or a full restoration project. I'll also be sharing how to mix, apply, and block sand your primer so you have a perfect surface for your new paint on your project. Okay, let's talk about primers. Let's talk about two different types of primers. We're going to make this really simple. These two primers will do 90% of what you need to get done when you're repairing your car or doing a restoration project. Now, 90% of the time, I use a 2K urethane primer, a direct-to-metal 2K urethane primer. It's important that you get a direct-to-metal 2K urethane primer. I'll tell you why later on. Now, for most of the repairs, we use the 2K urethane primer. So in my opinion, a 2K epoxy primer is best used for a restoration project. For example, if you're restoring a vehicle in your spare time, but you want to take it down to bare metal, a 2K epoxy primer is perfect for this situation. You can do one panel at a time, strip it down, get it into 2K epoxy primer. You can let that sit as long as it's inside for a very long period of time, and then you can do your body work right over top of it. Now, it's important to remember that 2K epoxy primer is not a sandable primer. It's not made to be blocked. It's made for corrosion protection, and you can apply filler over it. So epoxy primer is superior as far as corrosion protection because it's less porous, so it doesn't allow moisture to soak in as much as a urethane primer does. But there are some drawbacks to it. It's like I said, it's not sandable, where urethane primer is much more versatile. I believe there are some epoxy primers that can be sanded, but for the most part, epoxy primers are not sandable. Now, the 2K urethane primer that we use for 90% of our work is a direct-to-metal primer, and that's important in case you sand through your body filler into bare metal. You don't have to be worried about primering over that. It's direct-to-metal, so it has good adhesion to metal. Now, this particular primer mixes up 4:1:1 for a high-build primer, which can be block sanded out if you have a wave or imperfection. You can mix it up 4:1:1, 4 parts primer, 1 part activator, 1 part urethane reducer for a primer surfacer. And that's basically just a thinner primer to create a barrier between the body filler and your paint. And the other nice thing is it can be used as a sealer, which I've used it as a sealer before and it works perfect. And that mixes up 4:1:2. So very versatile product. If you have any other questions about primers that I didn't mention here, let me know down in the comments below. Okay, so we have our primer all mixed up. I'm using the Viva R802 for my primer gun. I've got my fluid volume turned 1.5 turns out from closed, and I've got my air pressure set at about 14 PSI. We're going to control the amount of fluid coming out of this and the amount of overspray with our air pressure. Because we're spraying this like a primer surfacer, I am just using a 1.3 tip out of this R802. We're just going to put one coat on. We'll let that flash off for 10 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and apply a second coat. And I like to let my urethane primer sit overnight. So usually I do all my primering at the end of the day, and then I come in the next morning, we can block it out and get it ready for paint. You want to try and apply your primer as smooth as possible. You want to overlap about 80%, just like you would if you're spraying a base coat. Okay, that looks good. Nice and smooth. Looks nice and straight. The body line looks good. We'll put one more coat on this. We'll let this dry overnight. And then the next step is to block sand this primer out for paint. So we let this primer dry overnight. Now we need to sand this and get it prepped out for paint. So what we'll do is we'll apply a guide coat. This will show us any high or lows, any texture in the primer that we need to remove. I'll start sanding this repair area with some 320 grit sandpaper on a medium-sized block. This is a firm block. There is a contour here, but we're just blocking it with the contours in a crosshatch or X pattern. This allows you to have the best results as far as getting it straight. We're looking to remove the texture and remove any scratches in this primer. So we want this primer to be as smooth as possible. As I'm blocking this, I'm looking for any high or low areas in our guide coat. I'm looking for any deep scratches that I might have missed. As you can see, everything blocked out really nice on the upper part of this bedside, so we really didn't have a lot of high or low areas. So next we're going to make sure we have a nice crisp body line. I'll show you how to do that. When I blocked the top part of this repair, I just blocked down to that body line, and that gave us a good guideline of where that line is. It's in pretty good shape right now, but I just want to make sure it doesn't get lost when I'm blocking it. So I'm going to tape off the body line on the top, and then we'll block up to that tape, and that'll give us a nice crisp body line. After I'm done blocking the bottom portion of this bedside, I'm going to remove the tape. I'll sand all the primer areas with a soft foam pad, 600 grit foam pad, and what I'll do is I'll just lightly go over that body line. I don't want it to be perfectly sharp. I want it to be a little bit rounded, so I'm going to lightly sand over that. It's not going to distort it at all, but it's just going to refine it a little bit so it's not quite as sharp. Okay, now I'm going to hand sand over this primer. This is a 600 grit foam sponge pad. I'm going to clean up the little bit of overspray from primer and around the edge of this, and I'll go over this primer with this. Just soften the edges, smooth it out a little bit, and we'll be pretty much ready to paint. We've got the garage all cleaned up. We wet down the floor. Everything's sanded properly now, so we're ready to clean this. We're going to use some 70% isopropyl alcohol and wash this down with a clean microfiber towel. The next step is to mask this off. We'll apply a wet bed before we apply our base coat and our beautiful looking clear coat finish. If you want to learn all the steps to get that job done, click on this video now. I appreciate each and every one of you watching. We'll see you next time on Garage Noise.